Impact can and should be measured for any organization, despite your size, no matter how old you are, no matter how many programs you have. Always aim to measure your impact, and that means we're looking beyond just output numbers.
The big call to action here for a lot of nonprofits is go beyond outputs. We've got to get beyond the number of people that are served, or the number of trees that are planted, or whatever the numeric output is, and start thinking more long-term.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. John Mark and I just presented a live webinar, and we're really excited to talk more today and break down that webinar. It was on impact measurement and communication. We focused more on the communication side, as a few weeks ago we focused on the impact measurement components. So we're really excited to do more of an AMA, Ask Me Anything style podcast and webinar right now as we recap what we just talked through, questions that came up over the course of our conversation with about 150 live participants. So I'm excited to dive in and talk more about impact communication with you today, John Mark.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and get started. We're talking about something I think is really, really important for people to understand, and it's how challenging it is to communicate the social impact that nonprofits create. And we want to do this so we can increase greater funding opportunities for nonprofit organizations, but also create greater engagement across all different stakeholders. And so when we look about communicating nonprofit impact and why it's so challenging, it's because there's a really wide spectrum of where nonprofits can find themselves. They can find themselves in a situation where they don't have any impact data at all. Like literally, they're not tracking any outputs or any outcomes. But they might find themselves having a lot of data in scrambled spreadsheets, where they may feel they have too little data or way too much data, and they don't know what to do with it. But something that's super consistent is that a lot of nonprofits just don't have enough time. Nonprofit leaders don't have enough time to measure and communicate their social impact. But what we want to talk about today is the tremendous upside of communicating your social impact. And the first and most important is that it establishes enormous trust and transparency for all stakeholders involved, for the people that you serve, for your board members, for your team members, for your funders. It's very, very important that we establish that trust and transparency, and nothing's more effective at doing that than the impact, like true social impact metrics from your programs. What you're going to see more and more today is what it does from a fundraising perspective. So if you want to increase donor engagement, make your fundraising more efficient and effective, communicating your social impact is probably the most powerful tool that you can use to advance your fundraising capabilities. What we also love seeing is that when you communicate your social impact, you're actually communicating the real value that your nonprofit creates. And so the value that you create is through your programs for the people or cause that you serve. And the better you communicate that, the better everyone understands the value that create. And finally, if you want to make informed, data-driven decisions, it's really, really helpful when you have the right impact data and the right means of communicating that data to your team members. And so something that we want to highlight right now is the funding opportunities. 97% of major donors state the number one reason for giving is the social impact that a nonprofit creates. 2/3 of family foundations claim that the positive outcomes that a nonprofit communicates and reports is the best indicator of their impact. And then we have younger generations, millennials, Gen Z, they care more about quantifying social change than most other generations have historically. And so this is when we know that measuring and communicating impact is critical. And if you missed our last webinar, you need to go over to our YouTube channel and look at our 3-part series on impact measurement. We did a deep dive on 3 different aspects of impact measurement. I know you'll find it extremely beneficial, but we're going to do a quick highlight here in just a moment. Lauren's going to take the reins and talk about that from an impact measurement perspective. Something else that we really want to bring up are 3 different studies that showcase that nonprofits that effectively communicate their impact outperform others that do not. And this is from a fundraising perspective. And so the nonprofits that communicate their impact more effectively have more trust with funders. And the Stanford Social Innovation Review had a paper, had an article that said that donors choose nonprofits. More and more is showing that donors choose nonprofits that showcase impact data with easily understandable metrics over those with just a good pitch, over those with just good stories. The Journal of Governmental and Nonprofit Accounting showed that donors are more likely to give to nonprofits that measure and communicate their impact. They raise more money, right? Those organizations raise more money. But also from a marketing side, NetSuite did a large study, and they're a great tech company. They did a big study, and they showed that nonprofits that communicate their impact are more effective at attracting new donors to their organization. We're talking about funders increasingly favor nonprofits that can prove outcomes, not just intentions. And so it's really important to see the upside of all this work of impact measurement and communication and see what that can do from you for a fundraising perspective. But at Social Impact Solutions, we're all about data, right? We surveyed 1,200 nonprofit leaders. We want to share something that we've learned. We found that 56% of the 1,200 nonprofit leaders that we surveyed claimed they struggle to communicate their social impact. And what's concerning to us about this metric, it's sort of a scary, response to see this, but it's been getting worse, right? As of today, it's April 4th, 2025. At the beginning of the year, this was much, much closer to 50%. So as more surveys have been coming in, more and more nonprofit leaders of all sizes have been saying they struggle to communicate their social impact, which is why we're doing today's webinar, right? So based on these survey results, we want to help you learn how to combine impact data and impact stories for more engaging communication and how you can use an impact report as a highly effective marketing and fundraising tool. So let's go ahead and pass the baton over to Lauren just a moment. We are both the co-founders of Social Impact Solutions. Obviously, you're about to hear from Lauren Vanderpool. She has a doctorate in public health. I'm John Mark Vanderpool. We started Social Impact Solutions about 8 years ago, almost 8 years ago, and we help nonprofits measure and communicate their social impact so they can raise more money and do more good. But without further ado, let's pass the baton off to Lauren so she can talk about impact data for more engaging communication. Lauren, are you ready?
Perfect. Thank you so much, John Mark, for the introduction and for getting us kicked off here. We like to talk about impact data and stories of transformation when we're talking about impact communication. As John Mark mentioned, we recently did a webinar on impact measurement a few weeks ago. If you're already watching this on YouTube, you can find those recordings. If you're listening on the podcast, go over to our YouTube channel and find those previous impact measurement webinars or recordings. Today, we're going to talk more about impact communication. And so when it comes to communicating nonprofit impact, we really like to focus on impact data and stories of transformation. Some of us focus more on logic and reason, others are more emotive and focus more on connection. But we know that most humans care about both to some degree. So communicating your data and your metrics along with stories of transformation really is a very effective way to go about impact communication for your nonprofit. And so here, if you're watching this on YouTube, then you can see these slides. Again, if you're on the podcast, then you're obviously just have audio. And we like to start with the numbers, the data. Usually that's harder for organizations to capture. John Mark will talk more about stories here in a little bit, but focusing on capturing data, more of the quantitative side of things, is really valuable. So think about your program's outputs and outcomes. This information is what a lot of funders want to see before they give their very first gift. It's also what they want to know month over month, year over year. These are the questions that even very loyal donors that are giving on a recurring basis, they still want to know more the outcomes than the outputs from your programs. Think of these numbers as sort of painting the stage, setting the stage for the scope and the reach of your programs, whereas the stories might be telling more of the depth from more of a personal perspective. If you have listened to a podcast or a webinar with us before, you've probably heard me or John Mark define impact, since impact is definitely a buzzword in the nonprofit industry at this point. We like to clarify that when we're talking about impact, we're talking about truly measuring change over time. And so usually we're looking at programmatic data, we're looking at outputs, outcomes, and long-term impacts. So we'll dive into that a little bit more in these upcoming slides. And outputs are numbers that most nonprofits have. It's relatively rare that we work with an organization that has zero output numbers. They might not have very many, but you probably know the number of people you serve or the number of products or supplies that you've distributed, number of programs that you have, um, number of services provided. These are all output numbers and they're important, and you have to have those before you really can start to know the true outcomes that you're creating or the true change that you're creating. But a lot of organizations stop here. They stop with outputs. And so you've probably heard me say this before, but we see it all the time. So we like to reiterate that these output metrics, the number of people you serve, the number of water wells you've drilled, the number of trees you've planted, this is all really important, but it's not true impact. It's not explaining the real change that you're creating, over the course of 6 months, 12 months, or 3 years. So that's where we move on to outcomes. Outcomes are where you start to see short-term, mid-term, and long-term change. So if you're focused more on healthcare or nutrition, this is where you might start to see a change in health status or quality of life. If you're focused more on generating revenue, job training, microfinance loans, that's where you might start to see a change in the local economy, or at least a change in economic status for the people you serve. If you're focused more on education, you might start to see higher graduation rates or higher pass rates among the students that you serve. Advocacy, awareness, and policy can be a little bit more challenging and take more time to see change, but you can still start to see shifts and changes in bills passed, policy change, improvements in the local justice system over the course of 3, 5, 10 years. So these are some examples of outcomes. Again, if you're watching on YouTube or if you're just listening to the podcast, we have a slide here it's more of a table or a chart, and it's showing the difference between outputs, outcomes, and long-term impacts. This is a modified logic model if you have a theory of change and a logic model to go along with it. So I'll just choose one of the examples here as a food distribution program. And outputs might be that 500,000 or 250,000 meals have been given away over the past year. An outcome might be that children in the program that are undernourished are gaining a kilogram per month. So that's a good thing in this case for undernourished children. And then a long-term impact over the course of 3 years, you start to see a 20% decrease in malnutrition or undernutrition for this target community. So these are just examples, but again, giving you an idea of outputs versus outcomes versus long-term impacts. And so that is a little bit of a recap more on the impact measurement side of things, but would love to spend more time talking about impact communication and where you can start to actually highlight and showcase these impact metrics. And so there are 3 key places where John Mark and I would love to talk about this a little bit more today, being your website, being email campaigns, and fundraising pages. And so this is an example website. We have not worked with Zoe Empowers, but they do a beautiful job of showcasing their outcomes on their website. This is actually what they consider their outcomes page. And so you can highlight and showcase outcomes, outputs, and other impact metrics on your website. And if you go to the Zoe Empowers website and then you go to their outcomes page, you can see that they have some output data towards the top. And then towards the bottom is where they start to highlight a little bit more about change from pre to post program. And I personally am a huge fan of pre-post assessments. It really gives you a much better picture of where people were at baseline and where they're at after your program. So an example here on the Zoe Empowers website is they have a statement. I believe that they probably distributed a survey or an assessment of some type and asked the question if people would agree or disagree that the home they live in is adequate and safe for their needs. Before the program, 33 98.2% agreed. After the program, 99% agreed. So that's a great example of how their program helped establish more safe and adequate housing. Another example on the same website, 0% agreed with this statement before the program, that through their work, they could provide sufficient food, clothing, school, and other necessities for their family and household. 0% agreed with that before the program, while 99.5% agreed after the program. So these are huge, phenomenal results. This is just an example of how you can showcase some of your information on your website. You don't have to have a standalone outcomes page. If you have enough information for that, I would highly recommend it. But getting at least an impact section on your homepage is fantastic. John Mark, do you have anything to add to adding impact metrics to your website?
I think it's one of the things that's so often overlooked. And I think the big call to action here for a lot of nonprofits is go beyond outputs. We've got to get beyond the number of people that are served or the number of trees that are planted or whatever the numeric output is and start thinking more long term. Lauren's been saying change over time. And so the output is that short little snapshot, which is important, right? You've got to have outputs if you want to have outcomes, but we've got to start thinking longer, right? And so the further and further you zoom out, the more likely you're creating a greater impact, or at least you're measuring what kind of impact you're creating.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. Well, let's move on to our second piece. Again, there aren't just three places that you can communicate your impact, obviously, but three key places that we advocate for are your website, email campaigns. So that's what we'll focus on next. And then third, we'll look at fundraising pages.
Perfect.
So here we're talking about email campaigns. We know that nonprofits under communicate via email as an industry. And so we like to advocate that nonprofits communicate more via email. It's a cheap way to communicate. It's an effective way to communicate to all of your audiences, whether that's donors, volunteers, partners, maybe even your beneficiaries and constituents. And we often see that nonprofits are particularly under communicating for new donors. So say someone that gives, they might send you a check, they might give online. At best, you might send an automated email saying thank you. But typically what happens is there's little to no communication immediately upon the donation, and then there's several weeks, maybe even several months before that new donor receives any communication from you or your team.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we like to advocate for is that you have a 3 to 5 series email campaign that when a new donor gives via website or check, you have a way to automatically, in an automated fashion, communicate with them. So again, if you're on the podcast and you're just listening, know that you can go over to YouTube and see example websites, see example email campaigns that we're sharing on our YouTube channel from more of the visual perspective. So this email that we're looking at here, it's an example of what you could include in email 1 of your new donor email campaign. It's a short email. It's scannable. It has bullet points. It has bold text. It has emojis. You don't have to do all of that, but just making it more scannable and less to read. But most importantly, putting some impact metrics, outputs, and outcomes in this first email is really helpful. If they're a new donor, they probably don't know too terribly much about your organization. So thanking them for their gift, but also explaining more about your mission, what you do, and what their gift is now helping your team accomplish is really effective. In email 2, we take a similar approach. Again, it's short. It's, bullet points, bold text. It's scannable, again, highlighting more of your impact metrics, helping the new donor understand how they can partner with you and how their donation or their investment is helping you change more lives. But also towards the end, we have a very short testimonial from another donor that, this establishes more trust. It helps the new donor understand why other donors have given and how they can stay involved over more of the long term. And then the last or the third email example here, again, is highlighting more about your mission, more about your programs, but it's really focusing on an impact story. And so John Mark will talk more about communicating stories in a few slides in a few minutes. But this is something else that we like to advocate for, incorporating both the data and the stories into email campaigns, fundraising campaigns, and things of that nature. So, John Mark, anything that you would like to add to more of the impact communication piece for emails specifically?
I think you did a wonderful job. It's very well said because you have stories that are just listed throughout all three of these emails. But here we have another story about a specific beneficiary that this organization serves. And then we have testimonials as you go through this. And so you can see the impact that an organization is creating from a story base, but as well as just seeing this from an actual metric base as well. And so it's just a very effective email. And then one of my favorite things that you've included in this email is that you have their impact report listed in email 3. And so think about what this does to onboard a brand new donor, right? You've already been thanking this donor for their gift. You've informing them of what impact their donation is making. And you're doing it again, again, and again. And you're not asking them for anything, right? You're thanking them and you're explaining what your organization does. And then straight into this impact report, which will likely have a call to action for more giving. It just sets the relationship so strongly, cements the relationship so strongly to being one of gratitude and being one about social impact from your programs, but specifically so that this donor can understand what they did with the gift, which is really exciting.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I know that you and I both would advocate, and we see this work all the time,
Mm-hmm.
right? We see this be an incredibly effective approach over the long term. So, not just for new donors, not just for a fundraising campaign, but to consistently throughout the year sprinkle in impact metrics, impact stories, lots of gratitude, like you said, into most email communication, most social media posts. So, really, any of your marketing and fundraising efforts, this works very well over the long term and throughout the course of the year.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Love the way you said that.
Yeah. Great. Well, our third piece here for where we would advocate that you communicate your impact data would be on your fundraising page.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have another example here from Partners in Sustainable Development International, another organization that has done a great job of highlighting impact metrics on their fundraising page. So it's still on their website, but in a more specific place when you go to actually make a donation. Towards the top of the page, they do a great job informing the reader or the prospective donor or the existing donor of who they are and what the problem is that they solve. So they're helping families in rural Bangladesh that are living on less than $2 a day. And so if we keep scrolling, still towards the top of the page, they start to have a lot of good pictures and imagery, but they're also saying very directly the impact of your donation supports 75,000 or more families being lifted out of poverty, $4 to $17 in social and economic benefits for every dollar donated, and the poverty in focus areas has been reduced by about 75%, which is huge. So they are doing a great job of communicating the results they've seen over the last however many years that they've been in operation. They're doing a great job of being very clear about who they're serving. They also have a story, an impact story here on their fundraising page. And then if we keep scrolling, they also explain that $25, $100, $500, they're explaining what that is going toward. So they do a great job outlining a variety of impact information, the impact of each dollar donated, and then they also have a clear call to action. So their call to action is donate to help end poverty today. Your call to action, can be shorter than that, but having a clear button throughout your fundraising page, along with stories and impact metrics, is really, really valuable. You
Mm-hmm.
don't want a prospective donor or a prospective partner or even a prospective employee, maybe, to go to your website and question, what it is that you do. You want it to be very clear what you do. You want the impact of your programs and your organization to be very clear. So again, highlighting those impact metrics and stories on your website, on your fundraising page, and your email campaigns is very, very effective. So I know that we had some questions come in,
We
John
did.
Mark, when we did this live webinar. So we'd love to chat through some of those before we move on to impact stories.
I think it's a really, really great summation of that. So a question that came up during the live webinar, which I think you're just perfect to answer this, is an organization that has very small output numbers. So they don't serve very many people, but they serve them over a very long period of time. So the example was we have about 20 beneficiaries in their program, but they've been serving them for about 8 years. They're a little concerned that that's not terribly compelling. And so what's your opinion on what that looks like and maybe how they could talk about their impact in an effective way?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's a very common question for smaller organizations. And I think this is the problem with the word impact being thrown around. I mean, it's fine. It's a normal word. We can use it in lots of contexts. But when we're talking about nonprofit impact, and sometimes that can mean website visitors, other times that can mean, the impact of a specific fundraising campaign and the technology used to raise those funds. That's not what we're talking about when you and I are talking about impact. We're talking about it more from a program evaluation perspective and, what change is occurring. So that being said, um, just because you're serving a smaller number of people doesn't mean you're less impactful. If you're just looking at outputs, if you're just looking at 20 people served compared to 20,000 people served, then yeah, if that's all you're looking at, then you're less impactful. But just because you serve more people doesn't mean that you're doing more for them. The organizations that are larger and serving 20,000 people, what if they're only having a quick touch point and only providing one food kit? I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but there's a place for small organizations, for mid-size organizations, and larger organizations. And so it's not just about the number of people served. Um, I would assume that smaller organizations, this one that you're referring to in particular, if they're serving 20-ish people a year, but they've been doing that for 8 years, and there's a lot of repeat customers there, if you will, then your services and programs are probably much more in depth. And so don't get hung up on just the number of people served. You need to look at that. You need to address it because sometimes that leads to really high dollar per output or dollar per outcome from more of a social return on investment. And that can be challenging to get funders, donors, granting organizations to support that. So it is worth looking at, but don't get hung up on, oh, well, we're small, so this doesn't make sense for us. No, impact can and should be measured for any organization, despite your size, no matter how old you are, no matter how many programs you have. Always aim to measure your impact. And that means we're looking beyond just output numbers. We're looking beyond just how many people you serve.
That's so good. That's such a good answer. And I think it's important for people to understand, what problem are you solving, right? Are you solving a problem at which it is like a vaccination program and you're trying to vaccinate tens of thousands of people any given month? That it's just, you have to solve problems differently with, depending on what the solution is. And so if you are a very concentrated, right, let's use that term, a very concentrated nonprofit where you serve a very small group of people for a very long time, you're still creating a great impact, but you have to measure that appropriately. Because like Lauren said, it's not apples to apples. Well, they're doing 20,000 people a month and we're only doing 20. You're not doing the same thing though. And so that's where the program evaluations and understanding what your program's actually doing and the kind of social impact, social and economic return on investment, all of that really plays a very big role. So I love that answer. So, sort of on the other side of that coin, there was another question that was we're more of an emergency type service, you know,
Mhm.
where they do not do long term at all. They are very much short term service. How do you think about that differently? And you had a great answer for the individual on the call, but how would you help other people think about the social impact of a very short term, like relief type service?
Right. And that is a good question. And again, there's a place for long-term engagements. There's a place for short in this situation, more of a crisis hotline. It might be, I don't know, a 30-second, a 3-minute, maybe sometimes a 15-minute conversation, depending on the nature of the call and depending on what you're addressing. Um, and so I think people can get really hung up on some levels of comparison with other organizations that don't matter. I said this in our live webinar. It can be beneficial to compare because if you're looking at someone an organization that's larger than you, that's maybe doing something better than you, looking at how you can do things differently and better is hardly ever a bad idea. But it's not, make sure that you're comparing apples to apples, or you're comparing it to a way that you or your organization can and should grow. Um, don't, if you know that your organization and your programs are going to maintain this crisis hotline and it's going to continue to be a short-term engagement, then don't compare to long-term engagements. If you know that your organization is going to stay smaller and you might grow from 20 constituents to 200 a year, but you're never going to get to 2,000 or 20,000, then don't worry about making those comparisons, at least not right now. So, circling back to your question, John Mark, about more short term engagements, um, that's fine. I think you just have to paint a picture to volunteers, to donors, to employees, to other stakeholders. Why are you doing what you're doing and why does it matter? What problem are you addressing? What secondary data is out there that can back you up? So I would assume, well, I won't assume, but I do know that there are crisis hotlines for domestic violence, for substance use, for suicide prevention. All of these things matter. All of these things are huge issues in our communities, in our, across states, across our nation, across the globe. And so using secondary information to say, well, we know that X percent of the population struggles with substance use or, whatever your mission is aiming to solve. And we also know that having a support line reduces overdoses by X percent. We know that having a support line reduces suicide rates by X percent. I don't know what those are, but I could easily look on Google Scholar. I could find other evidence-based research articles where larger studies have been done to support and explain the evidence and the reason for a crisis line or a support line. So start there if you don't know where else to start, but absolutely work on how you can start to capture your own primary data internally as well. I understand that in a situation like this, a lot of information would need to remain confidential, anonymous. That's fine. You can still gather information. An example that comes to mind is getting a phone system or a software system to where you can do a survey at the very end of the call. It can be a quick 1, 2, 3 question survey that takes no longer than 30 seconds to complete. So that could be a starting point. But if you absolutely can't capture any data, then at least relying on secondary data, highlighting the problem, and using secondary data to back up why you do what you do and why it's effective is also a great place to start.
Wonderful answer. I think that was great. I think this is a good time to transition into the narrative side, into the qualitative story based side of the impact stories and the impact measurement. And so I'm going to go back to the presentation to where we can just talk exactly about that. So the qualitative data, right? This is where we talk about the stories. A lot of people wonder, like, where do these stories come from? Well, these stories come mostly from beneficiaries of your programs in the form of testimonials, interviews, and focus groups. But what we really want to be sure that we're communicating is what was the person's life like before your program, and what does their life look like after your program? And so for some of you that might be thinking, well, we aren't human services. We're an environmental organization. That's awesome. Instead of saying what that person's life was like, just say what that specific ecosystem was like, or what that environmental problem that you're solving was like before your intervention. Or if you're more on the advocacy side, what is the state of it today and what are the consequences if we don't do anything? Right? Think about it that way. But we also want to say, where will it be when we accomplish our goal? Right? We've got to shine light on the future here. And so that's what you really want to do to be sure that you can connect with stakeholders effectively. But we've been a StoryBrand certified company for many years. I think we're up on 8 years of being a StoryBrand certified company. We help nonprofits tell their story very effectively. And there's many different ways to tell a story, but our favorite framework is just the common story arc framework of starting with the problem, plan, and then solution. So the problem that your nonprofit solves, or the problem that the people that you serve are going through, a plan, what your nonprofit is doing to solve that problem, and then the solution, what does their life look like, or what does the world look like because you are solving that problem. And so let's just do a quick example here. This is just a fictitious example of Eduardo is a child with disabilities in rural Honduras. He doesn't have access to a wheelchair and his family cannot afford disability services for him. It's 2 sentences that we have right here clearly explaining the problem that this young man is going through. But then one day, this is the plan section, Eduardo met Juanita, a nurse with the organization who brought him into their disability center, gave him a wheelchair, and prescribed a personalized physical therapy plan to help him cope better with his disability. So here we have a plan section, and you'll notice that there's a 3-step plan in here. You say, one day, Eduardo met Juanita, a nurse with this organization name, who did 3 things: brought him to the disability center, gave him a wheelchair, and prescribed a personalized physical therapy plan to help him better cope with a disability. That's great. Now, what is really important to understand is I know that this fictitious nonprofit is just like yours, and it does a lot more than those 3 things. And that's the hard part here. The hard part is taking all of your different programs and condensing it into 3 simple steps, right? And that's a very, very important exercise to go through, because no new donor or prospective donor has time to understand how all of your different programs work. So make it really, really simple in a 3-step plan. But now we want to talk about the solution. And you'll notice here on the solution, we are pivoting the story to thank the donor for supporting their program, right? The donor's not the hero of this story, but it's important that we just thank the donor for their contribution. So here we have the solution statement. Thanks to your support of the program, Eduardo gets the medical attention he desperately needs. He finally has access to a wheelchair and is able to enjoy meeting and playing with other children like him. That's a great solution statement, right? We have shown what his life was like before and after, just like we said we should, but we don't like stopping there. We want to talk a little bit more about some impact data that could be included in the story. So we added to the solution and said, because of our program, Eduardo's mother is now able to work, and she has helped double their family's monthly income, lifting their family out of poverty. That's an amazing statement, right? Assuming all of that's true, that is a remarkable accomplishment, a remarkable impact that this nonprofit has empowered this family to achieve. And so that's really, really important that we remind funders, or that we make funders aware of the impact that their gift creates, because it's not just a wheelchair, even though it's an amazing thing. It's a wheelchair plus relationships with other children with disabilities, plus a personalized physical therapy plan, plus it's also giving his mother the ability to work, and it's also doubling their family's monthly income. So that's how you sort of value stack all of these different impacts on top of each other in a very effective way. And then we just finish it with a more of a sentiment type statement. Even better than all of those great things that we just listed. She now has the relief that Eduardo is getting the services he needs to thrive. So this is like 6 sentences, right? It's a very, very short story, but you'll notice that it follows the problem, plan, solution framework. It's just 2 sentences here, 1 sentence there, 3 to 4 sentences here. And this can be used in a myriad of different ways, and we're going to talk about those ways in just a little bit. But it's just important to understand you don't have to make these terribly complicated to make them very compelling. And something that we're often asked, which is better, quantitative or qualitative? We're a little bit biased. We like the quantitative side more over at Social Impact Solutions. Even though we've been StoryBrand certified, for 8 years, we're very much data heavy. But what we know works is that both work, right? They both work extremely well when you combine them together. Because like Lauren said at the beginning of this part of the presentation, you want to do the hearts and the minds. You win the hearts with stories, you win the minds with metrics. And it's important that you combine both of these and consistently use them across your marketing campaigns, across your fundraising, across your recruiting for new team members and board members. And the thing is, when you tell these stories so effectively and you use the right impact metrics, you empower donors, volunteers, board members, all stakeholders they would give them the information they need to justify giving to your organization. Love to know if we have any questions that we want to go over, Lauren, regarding impact stories. I know we had a few there during the webinar, but if you want to bring the first one up, I'd be happy to go forward.
Yeah, I think one that comes up often that we hear a lot is just how to get stories from the field. Oftentimes that feels like a challenge or a struggle for a lot of organizations.
It's a great point. It's a really, really good point. And I think the most important thing you can do is, number one, look at the context in which you're working. If you are dealing with human services and maybe you're a US based healthcare organization, you absolutely need to follow HIPAA regulations, right? You absolutely need to abide by legal requirements. You need to respect privacy. You need to be very intentional with how you capture, collect, and then report this information. Without getting into the weeds and all the different ways you can do this, you want to bake this into your process of your programs. And it's important that you see your entire program sort of mapped out and determine at which point would it be appropriate to determine where our beneficiaries are before they enter our program. So the intake form is a very, very effective place to start to capture some of this information. But also just sort of look at the different stages of your program and say, when's the best time to conduct a survey or to do some focus groups? And that's when you want to see, like, this is when we do our focus groups in the program. So we can consistently capture stories of transformation. The same is true with impact measurement. But you want to think about being as respectful as you can towards all beneficiaries. Sometimes it's more appropriate to make things anonymous, which is perfectly fine. What we care about is that you tell the truth, right? That's what we care about.
Yeah.
And so the truth is what matters. The truth is what everyone wants to know. That's a great question, and I appreciate you asking. If you have anything to add to that, please do.
Yeah, I think another thing that when you said we just want you to tell the truth, I know you and I are both seeing organizations that are generating fake stories with AI,
Right.
and I'm not a huge fan of that because I personally believe that almost always there is a way to capture stories, and you might not use people's faces, you might not use their names, but you can still share their story, obviously with their consent. Um, Focus groups are great because then you're saying, well, participant 1 said this, participant 6 said this. Ideally, you have 6 to 8 people in a focus group. So those can be a great way to keep things more anonymous or confidential, while at the same time they're sharing this information in a group setting. So that changes things. However, I've talked to a couple of other, nonprofit consultants, and they have interesting perspectives of AI generated stories. That maybe it is more helpful or valuable for certain audiences or for certain organizations. But I think we can all agree that being very transparent, whether you're speaking to a donor audience, a volunteer audience, corporate partners, it doesn't matter. If you're using AI generated stories, please don't use them like they're real from the field. Someone will find out at some point, and it's just not worth that backlash and that loss of trust. So if that's how an organization chooses to communicate stories, I don't think I would call them impact stories, if I'm being completely honest.
Right.
Um, just don't treat it as marketing filler.
Right.
Have a reason to do that, and then have an asterisk at the bottom that says, this story is generated by, you know, AI or whatever platform you used, and then have a reason as to why that's the case. So I think that's an important piece to cover, as so much content is being generated by GPT or other AI platforms.
Right. And we're not anti AI. That's not the point. The point is tell
No.
the truth, right? So
Yeah.
that's what you want to do. Is
Yeah.
you want to tell the truth because, like she said, the backlash, it doesn't take long for someone to fish around and determine that, oh, that story was completely fake.
Yeah.
And you could say, well, it's similar to other stories. Just tell the other stories. I mean, just tell the truth. Like, you're going to run into more problems than you would ever like to if you just generate, fictitious stories. I mean, GPT has amazing capabilities. Its capability is not, telling the truth of what's coming out of your programs.
Yeah.
Right. So just capture the truth. Make it anonymous. If that's what you want to do, great. If that's what you need to do, absolutely do that. But there's
Yeah.
no reason to risk lying just because it's easy.
Right.
Yeah, great point.
Agreed. Wonderful. Well, I know that we could cover a lot of questions about impact data and impact stories. I think a lot of the questions come with more impact reports, which is what we focus on towards the latter part of this presentation. So I'll go ahead and dive into impact reports. Then, John Mark, I know you have a few slides on some really valuable ways that impact reports can be practically used and applied.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love to address some misconceptions that we see and hear relatively often. A lot of people think that donors don't want to read a long report, or a lot of nonprofits feel like they don't have time to create an impact report.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you don't think that an impact report is going to help you raise money, and therefore ultimately it's going to be a waste of time. All of these things can be true, but when impact reports are created and used effectively, we see nonprofit organizations save a ton of time when they have a good impact report that is being circulated internally and externally. A lot of people think of an impact report and they think, oh, well, this is just for donors, it's just for external communication purposes. We totally disagree with that. A good impact report is a phenomenal tool for your internal teams. It can help get multiple team members, multiple departments on the same page. It's a huge asset for your marketing and fundraising teams. Marketing and communication often struggle to get stories from the field. They struggle to get consistent, clear impact data. And they don't feel like they have enough of that usually to incorporate into their marketing campaigns and deliverables. Similar with fundraising teams. Development and fundraising teams, they're typically the ones that are hearing this first. They're hearing from grants, foundations, donors, corporate partners. They're the ones that are getting these requests or demands, maybe, from funders who want to know the impact. And so making sure that both marketing, development, and other teams have this information gets everyone on the same page. It really is a valuable way to inspire people internally and externally and communicate clearly over the course of the next 3, 6, 12 months. So ultimately, using your impact report to be a really valuable piece of marketing and fundraising collateral is what we love to see. Some key sections for an impact report that we like to really focus on are a theory of change, along with your logic model. We also like to highlight your top 3 programs. If you are a larger organization, if you just really feel the need to communicate and talk more about more than just 3 flagship programs, that's okay. But typically, we like to aim for 3 flagship programs being highlighted. Share your outputs, but definitely focus more on outcomes. Focus more on the change that's occurring from pre to post program, or maybe from last year to this year. And then, of course, highlighting stories of transformation for each of these respective programs as well. Uh, Also, in your impact report, make sure that the reader is they're understanding how they're making a difference. So, an impact report is not, it's really not meant for your organization to look like the hero. It really is meant to help donors, help volunteers, help your internal employees understand how their contributions are making these changes a reality. So you can have a half page, a full page, a bifold that's dedicated more to donors, to volunteers, to employees, and that way you can engage and talk to each type of stakeholder without having to create an entirely separate report for each of them. This will also paint a really clear picture as to where you've been and where you're going in the short, mid, and long term. So it helps people understand how last year helped you get to where you are this year and how your goals for 2025 are setting you up for success in 2026, 2027, and beyond. And then lastly, having a clear call to action. If you do want to use this as a fundraising piece, have a clear call to action on give to this campaign or donate today, or maybe volunteer here or volunteer with this program. So just have one call to action, ideally. Make it really clear throughout the report. If you choose not to have a call to action, if it's really just expressing a lot of gratitude and it's more of an update and a thank you, that's okay too.
Mhm.
But these are some of the key things that we see missed with the development of an impact report.
Right. It's a really good point. And I think it's really important for people to understand, an impact report really is like a foundational document for an organization that you want to update every year, right? Because you want to report on the impact that you create on an annual basis. The reason why we call it a foundational document is because it's such a powerful tool to get all departments on the same page. If anyone has been in the nonprofit space for any amount of time, understand how easy it is to get misaligned and how easy it is for different departments to have their own silos. Impact really is the thing that brings everyone together. And that's donors, that's marketers, that's developers, that's people in programs, that's finance, it's ops, it's everybody. The impact that our organization creates really is the thesis for the nonprofit. And so it's a really powerful tool for internal teams to use the same language, to get back on the same page, to align them around the mission. It's super inspirational, but it's also extremely helpful to get your board members and developers to give them the information that they need to start fundraising really effectively. And that's what we see that's so great with compelling impact reports is that it can be extremely beneficial for getting everyone aligned. Now, we also love using impact reports from an external marketing communication standpoint. You want to use this language on your website. You want this want to be all over your emails and social media. But the challenge that we have for you is not just to do that for the month after the impact report is published, do it for the entire year, right? We like to encourage organizations to use 80% of their marketing and communication to be gratitude focused, impact metric focused, and impact story focused. 80% of all communication, whether that's a donor script or an email to like a marketing email, 80% of that content to be gratitude, impact story, and impact metric. That means 20% of the time you're reminding people of the problem that you solve and calling them to action, like give today or volunteer today, that kind of an idea. And so your impact report is so helpful in repurposing content because so many marketing teams and communication teams just do not have enough content for throughout the year. They're always scratching their head or begging their programs for information, stories from the field, things like that. That's what your impact report can be extremely helpful in helping your team accomplish. But it's also great for setting your fundraising team up for success. This is the language you want your development officers using. This is the language you want your grant writers using. This is the language you want your board using as they are raising more money for your organization. To have all of your impact data and stories in one spot is extremely helpful. So think about your impact report being repurposed as a development script or like a phone script. Or if it's a cold email or a cold call or a mailer or an SMS message. All of that is so helpful to pull from an impact report, sort of a source of truth for your team for that given year, to use that language more effectively. It helps you keep all of your communication so much more consistent, which is a great thing. And so I think we've got a handful of questions that we had during our webinar that we would love to go over right now.
Yeah, I think one that we get a lot and the one that we got in this webinar earlier today is what's the difference between an impact report, an annual report, and maybe a case for support?
Great question. So there's a lot of similarities. I think that's why there's some confusion. An annual report is a little bit more of just here's what happened this year. Right. Here was our financial documents. Here's how much we spent. Here's how much we made. It's more like a profit and loss with a 990. It's a little bit more due diligence, focused. And that's important. We love that. It's all really, really important. But too often, annual reports do not have anything compelling as to where the organization is going. Right. Impact reports absolutely do that. And so a question that we get is, well, can you integrate the two together? 100%, right? You can absolutely integrate the two together. Just remember your impact report is all about the change that your organization has created and plans to create. That's what we want to really lean into. Now, a case for support is a little bit different, but we love case for supports because a case for support is focused on, hey, this is the problem that we want to go solve. We just need some funding to go solve it. But the reason why we love impact reports to support cases for support is because you need to have the trust, the authority of, what have you done in the past? What's your current infrastructure for solving problems like this? Why should I trust you? And that's really what a case for support is begging. It's that kind of data to be able to take the organization to the next level, to be able to present that to a future funder to trust you to give you money. And so I love that question. And I think all three of those documents are extremely important, but there's a lot of carryover. And when you get your impact report right, the others are a walk in the park.
Yeah, and they can be used, like you said, for similar and different purposes. But I don't think that an annual report or a case for support highlights the true impact, the true change being created, like we would advocate for with an impact report.
Right.
Yeah.
I think a question that I would love to ask you is, with small organizations, so very, very few team members, oftentimes they don't feel like they have the capacity or they have the brain space or they have the resources to take on a project like an impact report. What would you say to someone in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, one of the individuals that raised a question in our live webinar earlier today, I think they said they're a team of two.
Right.
And so that is challenging. You and I can empathize. At one time, we were a team of two as a for-profit, not a nonprofit, but it's hard to wear so many hats and it's hard to do all the things, all the moving parts, and to do it well. So for those organizations that are really small, very small teams, I would first ask, do you even have any impact data? If so, what is it? What does that look like? What do you do? What's the nature of your programs? But that being said, we have worked with, it's not typical, but we have worked with smaller organizations that are a team of 2, 3, or 4 people. Usually we're working with organizations that are larger than that, but we've seen phenomenal results for smaller organizations too. So that can be an option, is you outsource this and you get it off your plate. You outsource it to someone, doesn't have to be social impact solutions, but someone like us who would do this for you and really take that burden off of you and your team. If you have impact data, then that could probably be pretty feasible. If you don't have impact data, you could still talk to an outside source or consultant, and they could help you determine how you can capture data in a reasonable way for a small team. If you don't want to look at outside help for whatever reasons that might be, I think this is an opportunity where you can explore some AI features. If you have data, if you have stories, if you have real tangible information to give to some type of AI platform, then it could help you at least with the outline of an impact report. It could help you build some of these things out. I would absolutely give ChatGPT or any others a lot of guidelines and guardrails on the front end. And then I would absolutely go back and edit it pretty heavily on the back end. I would not just throw in a few numbers and, use whatever it spits out. But AI could be beneficial for smaller teams who don't have the budget or don't have the time. Those are sort of the first two that come to mind, would be AI or outside consultants, or potentially both.
These are great answers. Really, really good answers. Just as long as you understand, like AI it's a wonderful tool, it has great skills, it has a great future, but it's not, there's always needs to be a human in the loop, right? You always
Yeah,
need to
yeah,
edit thoroughly. And they know that. OpenAI knows that. That's how it works. I
yeah.
think some people are either afraid of it or they're too trusting of it. That's sort of the
Mhm.
spectrum that you see there. And
Yeah,
just be the human in the loop. It's an amazing innovation, right? But you just have to stay in the loop on that. And I think those are
absolutely.
great answers. Really, really good answers. As we go back to the presentation, we have to ask the question, why is it that so many organizations struggle to communicate their impact? We talked about at the beginning, 56% of nonprofit leaders that we surveyed stated they struggle to communicate their social impact. And,
Mhm.
there's a lot of reasons for it, but I think the main reason is that nonprofit leaders are extraordinarily busy, right? They're wearing way too many hats. There's so much on their plate. They don't have the time, the training, the expertise to conduct research, right? They don't know how to apply it to their departments. Oftentimes, they're way too close to the problem to be able to see the solution, and that's extremely common. The thing that we see that drives us crazy is that there aren't very good resources out there for nonprofits, right? That's why we started Social Impact Solutions. We saw there are not very many good resources out there for the nonprofit community, especially as it pertains to impact measurement and communication. And so we see lots of organizations underreporting their social impact. It's terrible. That means their teams do not understand the value that they're creating very often. It means their funders don't understand the value that they're creating. As we said at the beginning of this presentation, this webinar, you know, that's the number one reason why people give to nonprofits is because of the social impact that's either being created or could be created. But what needs to happen is for people to communicate that impact in a clear and compelling way. And we just want to say, imagine the difference that could be created. Imagine the greater engagement and growth your nonprofit would experience if you communicated your real impact. That is what we want to share with you today, an opportunity to learn how to communicate your impact, measure your impact, and do it so much more effectively. We put together what we call our fundraising quiz. And you can access this at fundraisingquiz.org. You can probably click on a link in the description of this YouTube video, or you get to just scan the QR code. But go to fundraisingquiz.org and take this 2.5, 3 minute assessment, and you're going to get a result. And the results of your quiz from the form of impact measurement, communication, fundraising, even some technology questions that are in there. So you can better understand what is it that's preventing the growth of your organization and what are things that you can do today to make it better. There's some pretty cool surprises on the back end of that fundraising quiz. You're going to have access to different courses, different videos, and different trainings that will show you how you can measure and market your impact so you can raise more money and do more good. So go to fundraisingquiz.org to get started on your fundraising quiz today. I think you're absolutely going to enjoy it. Malone, I thought this was a great conversation and really appreciate your time with us.
Yeah, likewise. It was a great conversation, a great live webinar earlier today, and I'm thrilled to be able to share this on the podcast and the YouTube channel as well. So I hope it's helpful for everyone who's listening.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for your time. Go to fundraisingquiz.org and we will see you in the next video.